The Third Eye, a supernatural mystery thriller. Prologue. Some say it watches from the shadows. Others claim it walks the graveyard by moonlight, neither barking nor breathing, just waiting. No one in Dornwald Village speaks openly about the old church or the man who tends it. The stories are passed in whispers, of a priest who never aged, a dog who never blinked, and a scream no one ever admits to hearing. But something woke up when the child died, and once it wakes, it does not sleep again. Chapter 1. The Village at the Forest's Edge. The village of Dornwald slumbered beneath a crown of dying trees. Winter had arrived early, biting the earth with claws of frost. Smoke coiled from crooked chimneys, curling into a sky the color of bruised steel. At the far end of the village, just beyond where the cobblestones faded into moss and dirt, stood St. Severin's Church, a crumbling Gothic relic with its spire split in two by lightning decades ago. Its stained glass windows were smeared by time, its bells rusted into silence. Only one man lived there, Father Dominic. He was a tall, gaunt figure, wrapped always in a black cassock that hung like shadow. He rarely spoke, and when he did, it was often to things no one else could see. He walked with a slow, deliberate grace, as though every step disturbed something beneath the earth. And he was never seen without Lucien. Lucien was no ordinary dog. He was massive, nearly the size of a wolf, with fur as black as coal and eyes like molten gold. He did not bark, nor growl, nor wag his tail. He simply watched, everyone, everything, with a gaze that made even the bravest men lower their eyes. Children were told not to stare too long at Lucien. "If he looks back," the old widows whispered, "he sees inside you." One afternoon, as the sun began to bleed into the trees, a shriek shattered the cold. It came from the woods. Within the hour, search parties were called. Torches and fear filled the forest paths, and then silence. When they found the child's body, it was beneath the old crypt behind the church. His throat had been torn open, his chest clawed, no animal tracks, no signs of struggle, just one thing. A black paw print at the edge of the crypt door, too large for any dog, too clean to be real. Chapter 2. The Body in the Crypt. They buried the boy before the sun could rise. No ceremony, no priest, just a hole in the frozen earth and a few hurried prayers mumbled through chattering teeth. The parents didn't speak. The mother's eyes were dry, not from lack of tears, but because she had cried them all out the night before, in the silence between her sobs and the distant howling from the churchyard. The villagers of Dornwald knew better than to ask too many questions. But the news could not be buried with the child. By dawn, it had reached the nearest city, and by the next evening, Detective Martin Krell had arrived. Martin was not a man of faith. He believed in facts, evidence, and above all else, reason. He had made a career out of unraveling what others called unsolvable. A string of murders in Nuremberg, the missing girls of Leipzig, a priest who poisoned his entire congregation in Bavaria, all solved, all tied up in cold, hard logic. When he stepped off the train and into the cold fog of Dornwald, he expected superstition and simple minds. He wasn't entirely wrong. The constable met him at the village tavern, where most of the townsfolk had gathered in a kind of collective silence, huddled by the fire. He was just a boy, the constable said. 7. Name was Elias Miller. Disappeared 2 nights ago on his way back from chopping firewood with his older brother. They got separated. It was dark. Martin took notes without looking up. And the body? The constable hesitated. You should see it for yourself. They led him to the morgue, a small room beneath the town hall, dim and cold. The smell of antiseptic couldn't quite mask the copper sting of blood. The body was laid out under a white sheet, stained at the chest. When Martin pulled back the cloth, his jaw clenched. The boy's torso had been ripped open, not cut, not stabbed, ripped as if by claws. Deep gashes scored his ribs, and chunks of flesh were missing. His eyes had been closed, but his mouth was frozen mid-scream. Any animal tracks? Martin asked. None, the constable said. But he pulled a photo from his coat. A print, black and wet, almost perfect in shape. Martin squinted. Paw print? Found just outside the crypt, he frowned. Wolf? We have no wolves in Dornwald. Haven't in 50 years. Later that evening, Martin walked alone to St. Severin's Church. The path was barely visible under the frost. A low mist clung to the gravestones, rising like breath from ancient mouths. The church loomed ahead, all jagged edges and crooked shadows. One stained glass window still glowed from within, a flickering light like a single candle. Martin pushed open the door. It creaked like bone. Inside, incense hung thick in the air. Pews stretched like ribs into the dark, and at the far end, before the altar, stood Father Dominic. "I expected you," the priest said without turning. Martin approached slowly. "I'm investigating the death of a child, found on your grounds." Dominic bowed his head. "A tragedy, but not unexpected." Martin stared at him. "That's an odd thing to say. The forest takes what it is owed. The forest didn't tear a child apart. Something did. Maybe something you're protecting." Dominic turned at that, and the candlelight caught his face, deep lines, eyes sunk like old wounds. But something ancient stirred behind them. Not fear, not guilt, something colder. "I protect no one," he said, "but Lucien, he sees." "Your dog?" Dominic nodded. Martin leaned in. "Then tell me what he saw." The priest's voice dropped to a whisper. "He saw the truth." Chapter 3. The Dog That Does Not Bark. The villagers had a name for Lucien. They called him the Silent Watcher, not out of affection, out of fear. He was unlike any animal they had known. He never barked, never played, never aged. He moved through the fog like smoke and shadow, his paw prints never lingering long in the snow. Some said he was blind, until they looked into his eyes and realized he saw far too much. Lucien had been with Father Dominic for over 30 years, or more. No one quite remembered when he arrived, only that he was always there. Detective Martin Krell returned to the village square just after midnight. The tavern had long since closed, and the last lanterns were snuffed. He climbed the creaking stairs of the inn, boots heavy with mud and silence. Sleep came slowly. At 3:07 a.m., a low growl woke him. He sat upright in bed, heart pounding. The sound wasn't inside the room, it was outside, somewhere down the street. A growl, long and low, like an old engine turning over in the dark. Then footsteps, not hurried, not clumsy, deliberate. Martin rose and moved to the window. The frost-coated glass blurred the scene outside, but he could just make out a black shape moving past the inn toward the cemetery. Four-legged, massive, silent. Lucien. Martin threw on his coat. The graveyard behind St. Severin's was older than the church itself. Cracked stone angels leaned at odd angles. Names had been worn away by centuries of wind and rain. In the center stood the Miller crypt, sealed after the boy's body was removed. The dog stood before it now. Lucien did not turn as Martin approached. He stood absolutely still, tail straight, head tilted ever so slightly, as if listening to something below the earth. Martin raised his flashlight. "What are you doing out here, Mutt?" No response. Just those glowing yellow eyes fixed on the crypt. Martin moved beside him. "You saw something, didn't you?" Lucien looked up at him, slowly, directly. Martin froze. For a split second, he couldn't breathe. It felt like the air around him was being pulled into those eyes, not just light, but memory. Images flashed unbidden in his mind. A boy crying in a dark room, a forest dripping red, a shadow with a silver cross tattooed across its chest. And then, nothing. The connection broke. Martin stumbled backward, panting. Lucien returned his gaze to the crypt. The next morning, Martin stormed into the town constable's office. "You need to unseal that crypt," he demanded. The constable blinked. "Why?" "Because something is in there, something that doesn't belong. The body's already been moved." "I'm not talking about the boy," Martin said. He hesitated. "There's something else. Behind the walls. A second chamber." The constable paled. "No one's opened that part in years." Martin stared at him. "Then maybe it's time someone did." That night, Lucien returned to the crypt, and something knocked back from the inside. Chapter 4. The Hidden Room. The morning was unnaturally still. Even the crows, which normally circled the village chapel like black omens, had vanished. Martin stood before the crypt again, crowbar in hand. The constable had reluctantly agreed to let him investigate, though he refused to stay and watch. "There are things we don't open in Dornwald," he muttered before leaving. "And we don't ask why they were sealed in the first place." Martin didn't care. He'd seen too much in his years as a detective to be deterred by old stones and older stories. The door gave way with a sickening crack. Cold air rushed out, dry and ancient, carrying the scent of mold, decay, and something else, metallic like rusted iron. Or blood. No, Grar. The main chamber looked as it had before. The child's resting place, now empty, a single candle stub melted into the stone floor. But Martin wasn't here for the main chamber. He moved to the far wall, where a faint line, almost imperceptible, ran along the mortar. He knocked once, hollow. He knocked again, and the wall moved. Not by much, but just enough for him to slide the crowbar in and pry. The stone shifted, grinding against its neighbors like teeth. Dust rained down, and then an opening appeared. Behind it, a narrow tunnel, slick with moisture and wrapped in cobwebs. Something carved into the threshold in Latin, Vidibunt oculi eis corda vestri. His eyes shall see your hearts. Martin took a breath, then stepped inside. The passage was cold enough to bite. As he moved deeper, his flashlight flickered, momentarily plunging him into darkness. When it steadied, the beam caught paintings, no frescoes lining the stone walls, ancient, crude, terrifying. The first showed a figure robed in white, standing between two great beasts, one made of light, the other of fire. Both bowed before him. The second, a black dog with 3 eyes, its center eye wide and unblinking, chasing a serpent across the stars. The third, the dog standing atop a mountain of skulls, its third eye glowing red as a line of people knelt before it, hands outstretched in fear or worship. Martin reached the end of the tunnel and entered a small circular chamber. At its center, a stone altar, carved with symbols so old they pulsed with their own rhythm. Dried wax from dozens of burned-out candles covered the floor, and on the far wall, a name. Not etched, but scratched, as if by fingernails, Dominic. Martin stared. Before he could move, he heard it. A growl, low, deep, and from behind him. He turned. Lucien stood in the tunnel, his fur bristling. But his eyes weren't fixed on Martin. They were looking past him, into the chamber. Martin slowly turned back and saw something etched into the far wall that hadn't been there moments ago. The stone surface was wet, as though it had just bled the message. The eye is open. Martin stumbled backward, flashlight shaking in his hand. His voice cracked as he whispered, "Dominic, what the hell have you done?" Behind him, Lucien let out a long, low howl, and somewhere in the village, another child began to scream. Chapter 5, The Journal of Father Elias. The village was already in chaos by the time Martin returned. A girl, no older than 9, had been found at dawn, half-conscious, curled beneath the chapel's side steps. No visible wounds, but she was shaking, eyes wide and unblinking, repeating a single word over and over in a whisper no one could understand. It wasn't German or Latin. It wasn't a word at all, just a sound. Lucien. Lucien's name. Martin didn't speak to the villagers. They wouldn't have answered him if he did. Instead, he marched straight into Father Dominic's quarters, past the rusted hinges and ancient oak doors of the rectory, and down a narrow hallway lined with faded portraits of long-dead priests. Dominic wasn't there, but the room held secrets. On a crooked bookshelf lined with dust and crumbling hymnals, Martin found it. A leather-bound journal, cracked with age and sealed by a strip of knotted string. The name on the first page made his blood run cold. Elias Hoffman, parish priest of Dornwald, 1892-1921. The entries began simply. April 3rd, 1893. A strange black dog has begun to follow me in the cemetery. The villagers say it is a sign of protection, but I feel no peace when it is near. May 17th, 1893. I heard it speak today, not with words, but inside me. A thought, a warning. I dropped the chalice during Mass. July 8th, 1894. The third eye opened. I do not know how. I only know what I saw. A man in white robes, his face shifting like smoke. Behind him, Lucien watched, not with judgment, with hunger. The entries turned darker with time. October 31st, 1895. They brought the boy to me, his mind broken. Said he'd wandered into the crypt during a game of dares. He came out screaming about a red star in the dog's head. He died that night. No wounds. February 14th, 1897. Father Dominic has come. He is young, but speaks like someone centuries old. He knows Lucien. He calls him the Hound of the Vale. He says I must leave soon. March 12th, 1897. I no longer sleep. The eye is always watching. I believe Lucien is not here to protect us. He is here to judge us. Martin flipped to the final page. There were only 5 words, written in trembling ink. Seal the room, burn the dog. He stared at the sentence, hand frozen. Behind him, the church bells began to ring. Not once, not twice, 13 times. He turned slowly to the window. Lucien stood at the edge of the courtyard, staring at him, not moving. His third eye, the one in the center of his forehead, was now open. Chapter 6. The Night Watcher. The third eye should not exist. Martin stood frozen at the window, breath fogging the glass. Lucien's gaze pierced through him, not just the golden eyes, but the one above them, the eye that should not be there. It was small, black-rimmed, and gleaming red like burning coal. It did not blink. The church bells kept tolling, 13 chimes, the number of judgment. By the time Martin raced downstairs, the dog was gone. Only footprints remained, 3 sets from the same beast. That night, the village did not sleep. Doors were barred, windows were nailed shut, candles burned low in every home, as if fire alone might hold back the dark. Parents held children close, whispering lullabies drowned in fear. And out on the frozen fields, Lucien walked alone, watching, waiting. Martin sat in the rectory, the journal of Father Elias open before him, maps of the church grounds laid out across the desk. There had to be a way to stop this, and it started with Father Dominic. He found the priest just before midnight, kneeling in the chapel before the altar. The only light came from hundreds of tiny votive candles scattered around the pews, flickering like stars. Martin approached cautiously. "Father," he said, "we need to talk." Dominic did not look up. "You found the journal." "I found a warning," Martin said. "A command. Burn the dog, seal the room." Now Dominic turned. "You do not burn a creature that does not live," he said softly. "And the room has already been opened. The eye cannot be shut again." Martin's voice rose. You knew what it was, what Lucien is. You let it feed." Dominic's gaze was strangely calm. "I kept him fed with sins, with guilt, with those who deserved his judgment. It was controlled." Martin stared. "You're saying you've been feeding this thing, people?" "Not people," Dominic said. "Confessions." He stood now, taller than Martin remembered, as if the years had fallen from his bones. "There are spirits in this world, detective. Not demons, not angels. Something older. Lucien is a vessel. The third eye sees what no man dares to name." Martin stepped back. "Then why is it hunting children now?" Dominic closed his eyes. "Because the balance has been broken." A loud knock shook the chapel doors. 3 knocks, then silence. Both men turned. A moment passed. Then, a scream from the village square. A woman's voice, raw and wild. A man shouting. Then silence again. Martin ran. Outside, the fog had thickened. The moon was gone, and in the middle of the square stood a man with his eyes clawed out, blood pouring from empty sockets. He whispered something before collapsing. "It showed me what I did to her." Behind him, Lucien stood, still, watching. He wept. From the chapel steps, Father Dominic stared into the darkness, and Lucien turned his gaze not to Martin, but to his own master. The third eye opened again. Dominic took a slow breath, and for the first time in 30 years, he wept. Chapter 7. The Confession Tree. There was a place no villager dared to speak of. An old, crooked tree on the northern edge of the woods, where the snow refused to settle and the birds never perched. Its bark was blackened, not by fire, but by something deeper, sorrow made physical. They called it the Confession Tree. Father Dominic had not been there in decades. But tonight, drawn by the rising pulse of the eye and the death that now walked freely through Dornwald's fog-drenched streets, he knew the path by heart. Martin followed him in silence, the woods swallowing the last sounds of the village behind them. Lucien trailed them at a distance, not like a guardian, but like a judge walking behind prisoners. The tree stood alone, gnarled limbs clawing at the sky. Martin stopped short. "What the hell is this place?" Dominic didn't answer. He simply knelt before the trunk and reached beneath a patch of earth already loosened by old hands. A buried box surfaced. Rotten leather, rusted lock. He broke it open with his bare fist. Inside, a stack of parchment, yellowed and brittle, dozens of them. Each page bore a name, a sin, a date, and a mark, cleansed or denied. Martin picked one up. August Bauer, 1912, assault of a minor. CLE. He stopped. The word had been scratched out. Rewritten. Denied. In red. Another page. Marta Klein, 1906, infanticide. Cleansed. A third. Dominic Weber, 1899, false ordination. Blood right. Cleans. Again crossed out. Denied. Martin's hands shook. These are judgments. Dominic nodded. Lucien does not kill at random. He listens to every word, every secret, every sin offered in shadow, and then he chooses. Or he used to. Martin turned. What changed? Dominic's voice dropped. The tree is full. He rose and stepped aside. Behind the tree's roots, hidden in shadow, was a crude stone arch, another passage like the one beneath the crypt. I sealed it years ago, Dominic said. Buried the confessions. Stopped listening. I thought if we stopped feeding him judgment, he would fade. Lucien stepped forward, his paw resting silently on the stone. The third eye opened again. The ground trembled, and the roots of the confession tree began to bleed. Martin stumbled back. The bark cracked open like a rib cage, revealing something pulsing inside the trunk. Not wood, but flesh. Strings of old parchment, black with ink and rot, hung like veins from the hollow center. And buried deep in that living wood, something moved. A voice whispered from the hollow. So many secrets, so many buried mouths. You brought him here, priest. Now he will listen to you. Dominic fell to his knees. No, please. Not me. Lucien stepped forward. The eye blazed, and Father Dominic began to scream. Not from pain, from confession. He confessed every sin, every secret feeding the eye. How he first found the dog, how he offered it penance, how he let the crypt stay open, how he killed Elias Hoffman, how he used the children one by one to keep Lucien quiet. The woods went still. And when the confession ended, Lucien turned away. Dominic lay in the roots, eyes wide, tears frozen on his cheeks, and the confession tree slowly closed around him. Martin stared. The snow began to fall again. The birds returned to the trees, and Lucien walked quietly back into the village, his third eye closed, for now. Chapter 8. The Eye Without a Master. For the first time in 30 years, Lucien had no master. Father Dominic was gone, absorbed into the confession tree, his voice echoing now only in the wind that rustled its dead leaves. The eye no longer answered to him. It was no longer fed through choice, and that made it hungry. Martin Krell returned to the village alone. Lucien did not follow. The streets were quiet, but not peaceful. Doors cracked open just wide enough for eyes to peer out. The villagers knew something had changed, something final. The priest they had feared was gone, and the dog they had once obeyed was now watching them with no leash. He found nothing. Martin spent the next day searching the rectory, the church, and the basement crypts for anything Dominic had left behind. Rituals, records, ways to stop it. He found nothing. Nothing but a single strip of old parchment folded into a hymnal. Written in Latin, crude, blood-stained. A binding prayer, but incomplete, missing a final verse. At the bottom was a name, Elias Hoffman. It wasn't a prayer. It was a trap, and Father Elias had never finished build his brow. That night, Lucien returned to the village square. No one tried to stop him. He sat at the foot of the stone cross like a statue, his eyes closed, the third one glowing faintly beneath the skin of his brow. He didn't move, but one by one the villagers came, drawn not by fear, but by the weight of what they carried. Confessions, real ones. They knelt before the dog. Some spoke aloud, some whispered. Some wept, and Lucien listened to each and judged. Lucien let him go. Old Man Dreyer, the butcher, spoke first, about the boy he struck with a cleaver during the war and left to die in a trench. Lucien let him go. Helena Grun, the baker, confessed to poisoning her sister to inherit the family store. Lucien stood, and Helena was gone by dawn. No blood, no sound, only the smell of burnt sugar and bone. Martin watched it all unfold, and with every confession, the eye grew brighter. Not blood red now, but a dull, golden white, like the last glimmer of a candle before it dies. Lucien was not hunting anymore, he was purging. The village had become a church, and he, its silent god. But one night, something changed. Lucien came to Martin, not with growls, not with violence, with silence. He placed a weathered page at Martin's feet, the missing verse of Elias Hoffman's Trap, written in ink and in blood. Bind the eye not with force, but with truth. It does not seek sin, it seeks a soul that can bear it. Lucien looked at Martin and opened his third eye. For a moment, Martin saw everything. A sea of voices crying out in the dark, a forest of eyes watching from beyond the veil. The origin of Lucien, not born but summoned by a village priest who wanted justice the church could not give, and the cost. Lucien was not evil, he was a mirror, and mirrors need someone to hold them. Martin collapsed. When he awoke, he was alone, but inside his mind something new had opened. Not madness, not fear, a calling. Lucien was no longer the vessel, Martin was. Chapter 9. The New Voice of Judgment. The change was subtle at first. Martin still bled when he shaved, still drank his bitter coffee with too much sugar, still cursed when the wind slammed the rectory doors shut. But something beneath his skin had changed. He didn't sleep anymore, he didn't need to. And when he closed his eyes, he didn't dream, he remembered. Every confession Lucien had ever heard now lived in Martin's head. Names, faces, sins whispered in the dark. He carried them all, not as guilt, not as burden, but as a ledger. Lucien had not returned. The dog had vanished into the woods the night Martin received the final verse. Whether he had died, dissolved, or simply walked into some unseen place, no one knew, no one asked. The villagers no longer came to the chapel. They came to Martin. He didn't speak, he didn't bless, he listened. Sometimes a whisper from a kneeling woman would make his breath catch because the words she spoke matched a name already inside his head. A sin already judged. Those ones never walked back down the chapel steps. The others left changed, hollow but lighter. They had been seen, scored and bore. One night a man came from a nearby town, a judge old and proud who sneered at the village's countryside cult. Martin said nothing. The man laughed, spat at the chapel floor and left. His body was found the next morning, mouth full of stones, heart crushed in his chest as if by an unseen paw. The villagers didn't speak of it, they only whispered, "The eye chooses." But something troubled Martin, something the visions hadn't explained. Why him? Why now? Why had Lucien offered him the eye, not as punishment, but as inheritance? He found his answer in the confession tree. One night, just before dawn, Martin returned to its gnarled roots. Snow fell gently, but none touched the ground beneath its limbs. The bark pulsed faintly in the dark. He knelt, and the tree opened, not physically, but in the space behind his eyes. He heard Father Elias, he heard Father Dominic, and he heard Lucien. The voice was cold and vast, like a thunderstorm held in a whisper. "I judged for them. Now you will judge for me." Martin understood. Lucien had been a vessel, a hound, a filter. But the world had grown louder, dirtier, more dishonest. And judgment could no longer be an act of the beast. It had to be human. He stood, walked back to the village, and when he looked at the world now, he saw not with 2 eyes, but with 3. Chapter 10, The Whisper of the Eye. The village of Dornwald never made the news. It was just a dot on a forgotten map, choked by forests and frost. Its chapel steeple broken long ago by lightning no one remembered. But those who came seeking answers, or escape, never left unchanged. Some left dead, some left silent, a few never left at all. Martin Krell no longer spoke aloud. He didn't need to. People heard his voice when they confessed, not through ears but in the space behind their thoughts, where guilt whispers and the soul winces. He was no longer a detective. He was no longer a man. He was the eye. He walked the village at night, as Lucien once had, his coat black as ash, his gaze heavy. Children no longer feared him. They feared their parents, for it was adults who carried the real rot now. Each sin Martin heard shaped the world a little more. Each decision not to punish twisted him further inward, because mercy, he had learned, was a heavier blade than death, and the eye whispered always. Sometimes it spoke in riddles. Truth that is not spoken is still a weight. Other times it gave warnings. A storm of men is coming, with cameras, with pens. They will not kneel, they will not confess. and sometimes it laughed. Then, one morning, it stopped. For the first time in months, the eye went quiet. Martin staggered to the old mirror in the chapel, looked himself in the face. The third eye on his brow was gone, but the imprint remained, a faint scar like something pressed into his skin from the inside out. He blinked, and in the mirror his reflection didn't. That night, the men came. Journalists, researchers, ghost hunters, priests. They came with equipment and cynicism and flashlights. They came to debunk, to expose, to purge. But when the sun rose, their cameras were empty. Their notebooks were ashes. And their faces, if found at all, were marked with a strange symbol burned between the brows. A third eye closed. Martin stood at the edge of the village, watching the dawn. He could feel the eye again, but it was not his now. It had returned to the deep, to the place behind the veil, to the place of judgment. Lucian's paw prints had reappeared in the snow, and the wind carried a voice only the condemned could hear: confess or be consumed. The eye was not a curse, it was a door, and now it was open forever. The end. The end.